So 2 plus 2 always equals 4, whether or not your mind is present to perceive that that's true.
Yes.
So these things are true regardless, they're mind independent, right?
Yes.
So if these things are not created by man, but rather exist instead as a metaphysical conceptualization of truth, how is that possible absent a creator?
This kind of argument is effective if, and only if, your interlocutor is a philosophical lightweight. And the truly frustrating thing is this. Andrew's entire position is, in fact, fallacious in the extreme.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Thank you to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Please consider joining our community today. Simply click the link in the description or tap the join button below. Thank you. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. And boy, do I have an annoying one for you today. The focus of today's video is one, Andrew Wilson, a Christian and political commentator who runs the very successful channel, The Crucible. In the clip that follows, Andrew reminds us foolish atheists that God is necessary in order to ground mathematical and logical truths. Unsurprisingly, I have a few thoughts on the matter, so let's not delay any further. I hope you enjoy it.
You said God is a man-made concept used to enforce morality, as are all religions. I believe Jesus was a real man, but he was not the Son of God, as God is not real, your words, not mine.
Okay, so let's start just very quickly the concept that God is made up.
Right.
Okay, and that's actually a way more powerful claim than you're not sure.
Is it, Andrew? Is it such a powerful claim to suggest that God is made up? Don't get me wrong, I grant you that the claim God is made up is a stronger claim than simply remaining agnostic. That's just trivially true. But you seem to be implying here that the claim God is made up is some kind of extraordinary, extravagant claim.
That's actually a way more powerful claim than you're not sure.
But I simply don't agree with this. Andrew himself is a Christian, which means that he denies the truth of the thousands of other gods that are on offer. Presumably, Andrew believes that all of those gods are fictions. So if we were to just use induction and induction alone, probabilistically speaking, any given God concept is more likely to be made up than to be the real deal, than to be the real McCoy. But despite this simple inductive calculus, here we have Andrew pretending that it's an extraordinary and extravagant claim to suggest that his God is made up, like all of the other ones that he would agree are made up. I mean, we literally live in a time where we ourselves as human beings have witnessed religions being made up. Scientology was literally invented, whole cloth, in the 50s. And now it's a global religion. So no, Andrew, it's not that extravagant a claim to suggest that a religion is made up, and by extension, a god could be made up.
Yeah, I mean, technically I'm not sure, because I think that's the most logical.
So then, if you're not sure, you're conceding that there could be a God.
There could be, but the percent chance that the being that they describe in the Bible is real or any other religious book, I think, is not likely. No.
Yeah, okay, so then you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic.
Yes.
You're saying it could be true.
Correct.
This has always felt like a hollow victory to me. A victory that can be scored against any intellectually honest person. What it amounts to is the solicitation of an admission that one's interlocutor could be mistaken. And while Andrew isn't necessarily an apologist, apologists do use this gambit to imply that atheists are non-committal, or to imply that atheists don't have the courage of their convictions, or something like that. And that appears to be what Andrew is attempting to do here. Oh, you claim to be an atheist, but you're really an agnostic. Gotcha.
Then you're not an atheist, you're an agnostic.
But this is nonsense. Surely anyone and everyone in this debate must concede that they could be wrong, lest they be accused of false certitude. Suppose I ask Andrew Wilson, hey Andrew, is it possible that God is made up? Or is it possible that God is a fiction? Surely Andrew would have to concede on these fronts and admit that he could be mistaken, lest he once again be accused of false certitude. I mean, philosophically speaking, we can't even be certain that the external world is real or that other minds exist. Thanks, Descartes. So certainty on God's existence is hardly tenable, especially when you consider that God is often defined as unknowable, or as existing outside of space-time, etc. But I digress. Of course, there are those who will bite the bullet on this point and insist that they are in fact certain of God's existence because they've had a religious experience, or on the strength of some ontological argument or what have you. But experiential arguments are plagued by the same Cartesian skepticism I referred to a moment ago, not to mention Hume's insightful contention that any allegedly religious experience is, probabilistically speaking, more likely the product of a misapprehension than it is the product of a genuine and authentic experience with the divine. And ontological arguments are so weak that they're not even ascendant among apologists. So I'm going to go ahead and pay Andrew the compliment of assuming that he has some intellectual integrity, in which case he would have no choice but to admit that he, just like his atheist interlocutor here, could be wrong as well. And given this logic, namely, that admitting one could be mistaken is tantamount to an admission of agnosticism, then Andrew himself must now be categorized as an agnostic as well. After all, he could be mistaken about his belief in God, so he can't possibly be defined as a theist anymore. No, he's an agnostic. End of story. Do you see how ridiculous this is? As I stated at the outset, this is a hollow victory scored against anyone who has the intellectual honesty to admit that they could be mistaken. So any atheist or theist who admits that they could be wrong can no longer identify as atheist or theist. No, they're all agnostics now. Please notice how destructive this semantic trick is. Suddenly, agnostic becomes a universally applicable category.
I believe evolution is true.
Could you be mistaken about that?
Well, yes, I guess so.
Ah, so you're really an agnostic on evolution then, aren't you?
I believe ghosts are fake.
Could you be mistaken about that?
I guess so.
Ah, so you're really agnostic about the existence of ghosts then, aren't you?
I believe the external world really exists.
Could you be mistaken about that, perchance?
Of course I could.
Ah, so you're really an agnostic about the existence of the external world then, aren't you? You see the problem here? This semantic framework renders everyone an agnostic, assuming that they have the intellectual honesty to admit that they could be mistaken. And while Andrew is free to define words however he pleases, because I'm certainly not a prescriptivist, I would still like to point out that such semantics do nothing to disambiguate and clarify, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the entire goal of language and categorization in the first place. What good is Andrew's semantics if, at the end of the day, it renders everyone an agnostic? But again, he's welcome to define things as he pleases. And I, for one, have no problem with being labelled as an agnostic, just so long as that label is applied equally across the board to both atheists and theists. I'm afraid we're all going to have to drop our monikers. That said, in my view, shackling certitude to doxastic states such that certitude is a definitional requirement makes no sense to me. Why can't I be an atheist, that is, someone who does not believe in a god or gods, and simultaneously admit that someone could prove me wrong someday? What's wrong with that? Is that so controversial? But whatever. Okay, Andrew, given your term usage, I'm an agnostic. As are you and almost everybody else on the planet who's intellectually honest enough to admit that they could be mistaken about that which they believe. So now that it's been established that there's no longer atheists and theists, just a gigantic pool of agnostics, where do we go from here?
Do you believe that the laws of logic are real?
I actually don't know what all the laws of logic are.
Well, so like, for instance, let's just take the law of identity. You can't be the person next to you, and the person next to you can't be you. You have to be you, and only you can be you, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and is that always true, or is that a man-made construct?
I'm pretty sure that's always true.
Well, if it's always true, that's really, really strange, right?
But
How could you have a thing which does not exist but is always true? How could that be possible?
Andrew is not very clear here. He starts off by securing agreement on the truth of the law of identity, namely that A is equal to A. In other words, something is what it is.
You have to be you, and only you can be you, correct?
Yes.
After securing this agreement, Andrew proceeds by asking the following question.
How could you have a thing which does not exist but is always true? How could that be possible?
How could you have a thing which does not exist but is always true? How could that be possible? Being charitable, I suspect what Andrew means to say here is something like, how can this abstract truth be true or real, given that it's not a concrete object like a chair or a laptop? In other words, how can an immaterial thing be, quote unquote, real? Or how can an immaterial or transcendent object exist given that it's non-physical? This is a really good philosophical question, a question which philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. But Andrew hasn't tabled this intellectually weighty question because he's interested in exploring the complexities of the philosophy. No, it's just another gotcha attempt. How do I know this? Well, let's get the obvious out of the way. The woman he's debating here is clearly ill-prepared for these topics. I don't wish to throw shade at her, or make fun of her, or undermine her in any way. But it's clear that she's not a philosopher. She's trying her best, and I admire her bravery, but she's wading in waters that she's clearly unfamiliar with. Case in point, when Andrew tables the laws of logic, she's clearly bewildered.
I actually don't know what all the laws of logic are.
Watching the video, it becomes clear that Andrew realizes that his interlocutor is struggling. In fact, Andrew and the Whatever podcast more generally have turned situations like these into a cottage industry. Situations where philosophically bankrupt individuals are confronted by Andrew and his compatriots in an attempt to make those individuals look foolish. This is not to suggest, by the way, that Andrew and his cohort are philosophically well informed, just that they know more than the average bear.
How could you have a thing which does not exist but is always true? How could that be possible?
3 minutes back.
I'm not sure how to answer, but I don't think that God is not always real because not everyone believes he's real. So by that logic,
What does that have to do with anything?
When Andrew challenges this atheist to account for the truth of the laws of logic, he knows that she won't be able to do so. It's a gotcha. It's, see, these atheists can't ground the laws of logic, therefore, atheism is foolhardy. Therefore, theism wins. Suffice to say, and unsurprisingly, the atheist misunderstands Andrew's challenge and proceeds by uttering some nonsense about how God is not always real, to which Andrew rightly responds, what does that have to do with anything?
God is not always real because not everyone believes he's real. So by that logic,
What does that have to do with anything?
At this point in the discussion, it's clear to any honest viewer that Andrew has the upper hand. And the truly frustrating thing is this. Andrew's entire position is, in fact, fallacious in the extreme. But don't take my word for it. Listen to what happens next.
Is mathematics something which is discovered, or is it something which you invent?
I think it's something invented to describe a reality.
And that reality is what?
Is if I have 2 oranges in this hand and 2 oranges in this hand, I have 4 oranges. The reality is the oranges.
So 2 plus 2 always equals 4, whether or not your mind is present to perceive that that's true.
Yes.
So these things are true regardless, they're mind independent, right?
Yes.
So if these things are not created by man, but rather exist instead as a metaphysical conceptualization of truth, how is that possible absent a creator?
Ding, 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 ding. That's the fallacy bell, folks. Did you catch it? So after walking this atheist through a field of her own ignorance and her own inability to account for the laws of logic, mathematics, and transcendentals, Andrew finally shows his hand and says, so if these things are not created by man, but rather exist instead as a metaphysical conceptualization of truth, how is that possible absent a creator?
So if these things are not created by man, but rather exist instead as a metaphysical conceptualization of truth, how is that possible absent a creator?
A textbook argument from incredulity. That is, the assumption that a proposition must be true or false based on the fact that alternative hypotheses are difficult for the proponent to imagine or conceive. You see, Andrew just assumes that his position is correct. He can't think of any other way that these transcendental truths, such as the laws of logic and mathematics, could be accounted for were it not for God.
How is that possible absent a creator?
Well, I've got news for you, Andrew. Your inability to think of alternatives does not constitute evidence for the truth of your theistic assumptions. At the level of principle, Andrew's position here is no different from the idiot who assumes that an unidentified aerial phenomenon is in fact aliens simply because, 1, they can't think of a better explanation, and 2, the other witnesses have been unable to satisfactorily explain it either. Here's the thing, Andrew. Even if no atheist on the planet could satisfactorily account for transcendentals, that wouldn't serve as evidence for the truth of theism. You'd still have all of your work ahead of you. The inability of one's interlocutor to explain something doesn't ratify your thesis.
No shit.
But that doesn't stop Andrew from interrogating this atheist, expecting her to account for the laws of logic on a non-theistic worldview, all on the assumption that if she fails to account for these laws of logic, that this somehow ratifies his position, his assertion. A textbook argument from ignorance fallacy. The fallacy of assuming that one's position is true because nobody has proven it false. But this is garbage. This atheist's inability to account for the laws of logic on a non-theistic worldview tells us nothing about the truth of Andrew's assertion that the laws of logic are accounted for by God. And to suggest or imply otherwise is fallacious in the extreme. The inability of one's interlocutor to offer a counter-explanation does not ratify your narrative, nor does your inability to conceive of alternative hypotheses. But none of this deters Andrew from spouting such fallacious nonsense.
So you're saying because we have mathematics, we have a creator?
We have knowledge.
No. I'm saying that if there's
documented.
transcendental truths, this is a wide concept and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just trying to break it down very quickly, right? If there's transcendental truths, meaning there are truths which exist, right, outside of the mind, how is that possible if you are claiming that truth is mind dependent?
This atheist has been somewhat inconsistent because in another part of the conversation, this atheist started off by saying that math is invented.
Is mathematics something which is discovered, or is it something which you invent?
I think it's something invented to describe a reality.
But then went on to admit that 2 + 2 being equal to 4 is a mind-independent truth.
So 2 + 2 always equals 4, whether or not your mind is present to perceive that that's true.
Yes.
So these things are true regardless, they're mind independent, right?
Yes.
And these claims, needless to say, are contradictory. Further evidence that this atheist is philosophically ill-prepared. Whatever the case may be, reasonably or unreasonably, Andrew proceeds by attributing the claim that truth is mind-dependent to the atheist. So Andrew asks, if there's transcendental truths, meaning there are truths that exist outside of the mind, how is that possible if you are claiming that truth is mind-dependent?
If there's transcendental truths, meaning there are truths which exist, right, outside of the mind, How is that possible if you are claiming that truth is mind dependent?
This is an interesting challenge for anybody who believes both A, that truth is mind dependent, and B, that truth can continue to exist beyond the existence of humanity. For if truth is mind dependent and yet continues to exist after all human minds have been extinguished, then presumably there is another mind in existence beyond humanity wherein that truth is grounded. This sounds promising for anybody with theistic inclinations, but if you inspect this kind of argument more closely, the unfortunate truth is, it begins to fall apart. For even if truth is ultimately, quote-unquote, mental or non-physical, God still isn't necessary in order to account for it. And only a philosophically ill-informed individual would suggest otherwise. Someone like Andrew Wilson. So let's get clear here. What exactly is Andrew saying? It seems to me that Andrew believes transcendental truths are ultimately conceptual. That is to say that things like the laws of logic and mathematical truths are mental or non-physical. So if they are 1, always true, 2, mental, conceptual, and or non-physical, and 3, independent of human thought, then there must be an ultimate mind who holds these mental, conceptual, and or non-physical truths in their mind, thereby serving as the guarantor of these truths. Put another way, God is necessary to ground these mental, conceptual, and or non-physical truths, because if all material minds perished, how could truth persist, if not for the existence of a divine mind? This kind of argument is effective if, and only if, your interlocutor is a philosophical lightweight. But a more informed debater would remind Andrew of the rich philosophical history of idealism, the philosophical view that reality is ultimately mental. Such a view, in its broadest sense, entails a philosophical perspective that emphasizes the primacy of mind or consciousness in understanding reality. It suggests that reality is fundamentally mental, mentally constructed, or otherwise immaterial. Are some idealists theists? Sure. But there are non-theistic varieties of idealism too. Consider absolute idealism. This view posits a single, all-encompassing reality, often called the absolute, that is not necessarily personal or divine. There's no need for a separate God to explain the persistence of transcendentals, as the absolute itself is the ultimate foundation of reality. The key point is, these kind of atheist idealists have no problem grounding the transcendental truths. So if Andrew thinks that he's scoring some kind of slam dunk victory against atheists when he tables transcendentals, he'll have to think again. But just in case you're still not convinced, consider Platonic idealism. This is a philosophical theory which was developed by Plato, a theory that posits the existence of a realm of perfect eternal forms, or ideas that are the true reality, while the physical world we perceive is merely an imperfect reflection or imitation of these forms. Such a view, once again, easily accommodates transcendentals, existing as non-physical entities in the world of forms, no divine mind required. But Andrew appears to be oblivious to all of these perspectives, an ignorance demonstrated by questions like this.
So if these things are not created by man, but rather exist instead as a metaphysical conceptualization of truth, how is that possible absent a creator?
Well, Andrew, as it turns out, grounding these transcendentals is not only possible absent a creator, but it turns out that there's actually a rich philosophical history of non-theistic views which account for these transcendentals. Just fine, I might add. Now, to be clear, I'm not endorsing any particular view here. I'm not saying that any of these views are true or successful in their accounting of transcendentals. I'm merely challenging Andrew's implication that non-theistic views are impoverished when it comes to accounting for transcendentals. Such a claim is categorically false. But I digress. Let's hear Andrew out and get to the final portion of the clip.
To condense it super easy, okay? If, like you say, everything is subjective and mind dependent, then how can you have things which are true even absent the mind? Unless there's another mind.
Well, because math is just the words we chose to describe. So, like, two.
What about the laws of logic, like the law of identity, which is always true? No matter what, it's always true. It can't be a human construct. It has to be objectively true. If that's true, and you're saying everything is mind dependent, but this would still be true even absent a mind, wouldn't that allude to the fact that there's another mind?
See, I'm not sure if I'm prepared to say that because I don't know that I'm at the level.
Well, then all you have to do is give me a scenario where the laws of logic wouldn't be true.
Regrettably, Andrew concludes by re-articulating the same argument from incredulity that he espoused earlier. In short, he can't think of a way that transcendentals could be true were it not for the existence of God. Therefore, God must exist.
Wouldn't that allude to the fact that there's another mind?
But as I've already pointed out, absolute idealism and Platonism can all account for transcendentals without recourse to an all-powerful creator God who exists outside of space-time. And these alternatives are just scratching the surface. There are in fact boatloads of views which also account for the existence of transcendentals, but leave it to a theist to assume that their view has an explanatory monopoly. This is incredibly common among apologists. For example, many apologists believe that moral facts cannot be accounted for by anything other than a creator God. They're oblivious to Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and so forth. If the apologist can't think of another way that moral facts can be accounted for, they conclude that God must explain it. In a sentence, it's mystery, therefore God. And we see the same from Andrew's fellow theists throughout history. I can't explain the thunder and lightning, therefore God is angry. I can't explain crop failure, therefore God is punishing me. I can't explain how life began, therefore God created it, etc. It's just a parade of ignorance. And here we have Andrew Wilson doing the same thing centuries later. I can't explain how transcendentals could be true without God, therefore God.
How is that possible absent a creator?
Well, I recommend you crack open a philosophy textbook, Andrew. Or perhaps a visit to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy would suffice. Because transcendentals aren't the confounding issue for atheists that you appear to believe that they are. But even if they were a confounding issue, let's go one step further and assume for the sake of argument that atheists couldn't account for transcendentals at all. Even then, Andrew's point of view here is garbage. Remember, one's interlocutor's inability to articulate a counter-explanation tells us nothing about the strength of your explanation. Think back to the UFO example. If I assert that the unidentified flying object is aliens, and you're not convinced, your inability to articulate a counter-explanation does not serve as evidence for my initial assertion. And so too it is the case with Andrew here. So even if no atheist in the entire history of atheism was able to account for or ground transcendentals, it wouldn't follow that Andrew's thesis is true. And Andrew is evidently oblivious to this fact. Not to mention the fact there's an equal and opposite school of thought in this whole debate, namely nominalism, the doctrine that universals or general ideas are mere names without any corresponding reality. Only particular objects exist, and properties, numbers, and sets are merely features of the way of considering the things that exist. In other words, nominalists simply deny the existence of abstract objects, such as transcendentals. Taking the example that Andrew used, that of 2 plus 2 being equal to 4, the nominalist looks at this and instead of grounding the logical truths in the existence of abstract entities or transcendentals, they tie them to how we use language. So the truth of a statement like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is not due to the transcendental or mind-independent existence of numbers, but to the way we've defined and used the symbols involved. Once again, and to be clear, I'm not endorsing any particular view here, not least because I'm not fully decided on many of these issues myself. I'm merely drawing your attention to some of the complexities and nuances of this debate. Complexities and nuances that are completely absent from Andrew's analysis. For him, this debate begins and ends with his own incredulity. Andrew can't think of another way that transcendentals could be accounted for, so he's happy to credit God.
How is that possible absent a creator?
Such thinking is a philosophical non-starter, and it's fallacious to boot. So while Andrew's audience probably left this conversation with the impression that he owned a clueless atheist, and she didn't know much to be fair, what actually transpired was a parade of Andrew's philosophical ignorance and fallacious reasoning. But what do I know, eh?